I never expected to find myself waging war against a group of retirees. After 5 years of battling traffic, noise, and the constant compression of city life, I had saved enough to escape. The city had become a pressure cooker, horns blaring at all hours, neighbors separated by walls thin enough to hear arguments about toast, and a sense of claustrophobia that followed me even into sleep. I needed space. I needed quiet. I needed air that did not taste like exhaust and anxiety. Quiet Acres seemed like the answer to a prayer I had been whispering for years. Located 30 minutes outside the city limits, it promised expansive lots, mature trees, and a community of people who valued peace as much as I did. When I drove through its winding roads that first time, windows down and breathing in air that smelled of grass rather than garbage, I felt something loosen in my chest. The realtor showed me a property at the edge of the development, 3 acres with an old farmhouse and a detached barn that stood like a sentinel at the far corner of the lot. The house needed work, but it had good bones, high ceilings, and windows that let in light from all directions. The barn, though aged with weathered wood and a slight tilt to its frame, captivated me instantly. I could envision it restored, perhaps as a workshop or a studio where I could finally pursue the woodworking projects I had been sketching for years. The association is very relaxed, the realtor assured me, sensing my hesitation at the mention of an HOA. Most members are retirees. They mostly care about keeping property values stable, nothing aggressive or controlling. I should have recognized the warning signs from the beginning. On my first official day as a homeowner, Judith Harrington appeared at my door with a gift basket and a smile that stretched her face in unnatural ways. She was in her mid-60s, immaculately dressed in beige slacks and a powder blue cardigan, with perfectly coiffed silver hair that did not move even in the breeze. "Welcome to Quiet Acres," she said, handing me a basket filled with local honey, artisanal bread, and an HOA rulebook that weighed more than both combined. "We are so pleased to have young blood in the neighborhood. I am the association president, 15 years running." She said this with unmistakable pride, as if presidential terms in an HOA were achievements to be mounted and displayed. I invited her in, partially out of politeness, and partially because refusing seemed like starting off on the wrong foot. She walked through my house with appraising eyes, making comments that balanced precariously between compliments and criticisms. "Such potential," she said, running a finger along a dusty windowsill. "We will be excited to see what you do with it." It was 2 weeks later when I first noticed cars lining the gravel path near my barn. I had been working from home, designing software systems, the job that had allowed me to escape the city in the first place, when movement outside my office window caught my attention. 3 vehicles I did not recognize were parked neatly beside my barn. I watched as their owners, all older adults dressed for what appeared to be a social gathering, walked toward the community center about a quarter-mile down the road. I frowned but returned to my work. The next day the cars were gone, and I almost forgot about it until the weekend, when even more vehicles appeared. This time, I pulled on a jacket and walked out to investigate. A middle-aged man was just closing his car door when I approached. "Excuse me," I said, "are you parking here for a reason?" The man smiled without concern. "Oh, you must be the new owner. Yes, this is overflow parking for community events. Judith said it was fine." My eyebrows rose. Judith said it was fine to park on my property. His smile faltered. "This is the designated overflow area. It has been for years. Did Judith not mention it?" I thanked him for the information and walked back to my house, a sinking feeling in my stomach. That evening, I called Judith, who answered with the same stretched smile in her voice. "Oh dear," she said when I explained my concern. "I thought Richard would have explained this during the sale. It is just temporary for monthly gatherings. The previous owner never minded. It is part of what makes our community so special. We share what we have." I ended the call unsatisfied but willing to be reasonable. It was only once a month after all. But the next morning, walking around my property, I noticed oil stains on the ground near my barn entrance. Candy wrappers and an empty coffee cup had been discarded in the tall grass. This was not temporary or respectful use. This was the beginning of something I did not yet understand, the first thread unraveling in what would become a tapestry of deception. The transformation of my property happened so gradually that for weeks I doubted my own perception. What began as a few cars for monthly gatherings evolved into regular weekend parking, then weekday evenings, then overnight stays. The cars crept closer to my barn until one Sunday morning I walked out to find 3 vehicles parked inside the structure itself. I stood frozen in my own doorway, coffee mug halfway to my lips. My private property, my barn, had people treating it like a public garage. The doors that I had carefully oiled and repaired were standing open. The interior space that I had been slowly cleaning for my workshop was now housing a Mercedes, a Lexus SUV, and a pickup truck with a Vietnam veteran bumper sticker. I set down my coffee and strode across my lawn, anger building with each step. The owners were nowhere to be seen. I pulled out my phone and called Judith. "There are cars inside my barn," I said without preamble when she answered. "Yes," she replied, as if confirming the weather. "The Johnson's daughter is visiting with her family. They needed the extra space. Is there a problem?" The casual entitlement in her voice sent heat rushing to my face. "Yes, there is a problem. That is my barn on my property. No one asked permission to use it as a garage." A pause followed, then Judith's voice returned with a chill. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding. The association voted last year to designate that structure as overflow parking. It is in the minutes." "I never received any notice of such a vote," I countered. "I never agreed to this." "The easement was on file when you purchased. Section 12, paragraph 3 of your deed refers to community access areas. The barn falls under that provision." I hung up and immediately pulled out my closing documents. There was indeed a mention of easements, but nothing specific about my barn becoming a public parking facility. That afternoon, I drove to the county record's office and requested all documents related to my property. What I discovered made my blood boil. The original easement referred to a utility access path along the far edge of the property, not the barn itself. Someone had been creative with interpretations. When I returned home, I found a pickup truck blocking my own driveway. The owner, a man in his 70s with a perpetual squint, was walking away when I pulled up. "Excuse me," I called out, "you cannot park there." He turned, looking annoyed at the interruption. "Judith said all areas with gravel are fair game during the book club meeting." "This is my driveway to my house," I explained, trying to maintain composure. "The gravel does not make it public property." He shrugged and moved his vehicle 3 feet forward, still partially blocking my access. I watched him walk away without another word, his stiff posture radiating indignation, as if I had been the unreasonable one. That evening, I installed traffic cones at the entrance to my property and a chain across the barn doors. By morning, both had vanished. A note was taped to my mailbox. "Removal of traffic management implements is a violation of HOA safety protocols. Further obstructions will result in fines." The note was unsigned, but I recognized Judith's handwriting from the welcome card she had given me. This was no longer about parking. This was about power, about who controlled what happened on my land. And it was becoming increasingly clear that Quiet Acres had never been about peace and space. It was about control disguised as community. I decided to mark my boundaries more clearly. I painted a sign, "Private property, no parking without owner consent." I installed it at the entrance to my driveway, making sure to use the exact colors and dimensions permitted in the HOA guidelines for signage. The next morning, I found it face down in a puddle. Tire tracks showed where someone had deliberately driven over it. That night, a Thursday, I counted 12 vehicles parked on my property. 3 were inside my barn. 1 belonged to Judith herself, a white Cadillac with a personalized license plate that read QACRES1. She had parked it directly in front of my fallen sign, like a flag planted on conquered territory. I spent the next week in a state of simmering frustration, researching HOA regulations and property law between work calls. My search for answers led me to Ben Caraway, an older gentleman who lived 3 houses down from me. I had noticed him watching from his porch swing when Judith and her followers parked their cars near my property. Unlike the others, he never joined them. Ben had lived in Quiet Acres for over 20 years. He invited me onto his porch and offered me lemonade that was more tart than sweet, much like the conversation that followed. "I used to own your place," he said, rocking slowly in his chair. "Sold it 5 years ago when Margaret passed. Could not bear rattling around that big house alone." I leaned forward. "Then you own the barn too?" Ben's weathered face creased with a wry smile. "Built it myself in '92. Never had a car parked in it except my own until Judith got herself elected." He told me how Quiet Acres had changed over the years. What had started as a genuine community of neighbors who helped each other had transformed under Judith's leadership. She had arrived 15 years ago with her husband, a retired corporate attorney. Within a year, she had maneuvered her way onto the board. Within 3, she was president. "First thing she did was rewrite the bylaws," Ben said, his voice low as if the walls had ears. "Added all kinds of provisions buried in legal language. Most folks here are not exactly contract lawyers. They just signed what she put in front of them." Ben explained how Judith operated. She would target newcomers or anyone who questioned her authority. First came the friendly suggestions, then written reminders, then fines for violations nobody knew existed. For those who resisted, the tactics escalated to social isolation, anonymous complaints to county officials about code violations, and in one memorable case, calls to an elderly resident's adult children suggesting their mother could no longer live independently. She got Harold Fisher to move out by claiming his bird feeders were attracting rodents, Ben said. 14 bird feeders he had. Been there for decades. County inspector found no rodent problem, but Harold was so embarrassed by the whole thing he sold and moved to Florida. I asked Ben about the barn specifically. His eyes narrowed. "That easement she is talking about. It was for the utility company to access the power lines at the back of the property. Nothing to do with the barn. But after I sold, at one of those meetings where half the neighborhood is away for summer, they passed some amendment about community resource facilities. Never specifically mentioned your barn, but that is how they operate. Vague enough to twist later." I pulled out my phone and showed Ben the photos I had been taking. Cars inside my barn, oil stains on my property, the traffic cones that had disappeared. "Document everything," he advised, nodding approvingly. "Every car, every license plate, every conversation, date and time it all. They hate paper trails." The next day, I received an official letter from the Quiet Acres Homeowners Association. It was printed on heavy cream stationery with an embossed logo at the top, Judith's Touch, no doubt. Dear homeowner, it read, it has come to our attention that unauthorized obstructions have been placed near the community overflow facility located on your property. Per Section 17.3 of the HOA Covenant, all such shared facilities must remain accessible for designated purposes at all times. Removal of said obstructions is required within 48 hours to avoid penalties as outlined in our bylaws. It was signed by Judith as president and two other board members whose names I did not recognize. No mention of the fact that the community overflow facility was my private barn. No acknowledgement that I had never agreed to this arrangement. Just the cold language of authority expecting compliance. I folded the letter carefully and added it to my growing file of documentation. That evening, I installed 4 security cameras, one at each corner of my property, carefully positioned to monitor the barn, my driveway, and the access points from the road. I made sure they were weatherproof, motion-activated, and connected to cloud storage that would back up automatically. As I mounted the final camera, I noticed a curtain twitching in the house across the street. A face appeared briefly, one of Judith's loyal followers watching my every move. I raised my hand in a friendly wave. The curtain fell back into place immediately. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with all the documents spread before me, property deeds, HOA bylaws, county zoning regulations, and printouts of relevant state laws regarding easements and property rights. The more I read, the clearer it became. Judith and her HOA had been systematically overreaching their authority, counting on the confusion and reluctance of residents to challenge them. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of my counteroffensive. I did not know then how ugly things would get before they got better. The security cameras were operational for less than 24 hours before Judith's response arrived, not in writing this time, but in person. She appeared at my door at precisely 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, flanked by 2 board members who stood like sentries on either side. All 3 wore expressions of practiced concern. We need to discuss the surveillance equipment you have installed, Judith said without preamble. There are serious privacy concerns. I invited them in, courteous despite my simmering anger. They remained standing in my living room, a unified front. The cameras monitor my property, I explained. Given the unauthorized use of my barn and driveway, I need to document what is happening for insurance purposes. Judith's smile tightened. Our community values privacy above all. Your cameras overlook areas where members gather. This creates discomfort. You mean they record people parking in my barn without permission? I clarified. One of the board members, a thin man with glasses perched on a nose too small for his face, cleared his throat. Section 22.7 clearly prohibits surveillance equipment visible from common areas. My property is not a common area, I countered. And I have reviewed Section 22.7. It refers to aesthetic concerns about visible security equipment on front facades. My cameras are discreet and necessary for property protection. They left with thinly veiled threats about further review by the board. I spent that day working from home, periodically checking the camera feeds on my phone. Nothing unusual happened until 3 a.m. when my phone buzzed with motion alerts. The night footage showed 3 figures moving around my property. Their faces were obscured by hoodies, but their builds and gaits were distinctly familiar. One moved with the slight limp that characterized Judith's husband. They circled my car, and then the feed from that camera went dark. When I checked the others, I saw them approaching each camera in turn, disabling or repositioning them. I waited until morning to survey the damage. All 4 cameras had been turned to face the sky or neighboring properties, rendering them useless without technically destroying private property. More disturbing were my car tires, all 4 slashed with precise cuts, and scattered across my front lawn was garbage, fast food wrappers, empty bottles, and what appeared to be the contents of someone's bathroom trash, including items no one would want displayed publicly. I called the sheriff's office and waited. Deputy Morris arrived an hour later, taking his time getting out of his cruiser. He was mid-50s with the resigned expression of a man who had seen this movie before and did not expect the ending to change. "Looks like you have made some enemies," he observed, barely glancing at my slashed tires. "I need to file a report," I said. "Vandalism, trespassing, and destruction of property." Deputy Morris sighed and pulled out a notepad. "Any witnesses?" "I have video footage," I explained. "It does not show faces clearly, but the builds and movements would be recognizable to anyone familiar with them." He wrote something down without enthusiasm. "So no actual identification." "I know who did this," I said firmly. "It was Judith Harrington and members of the HOA board. They came by yesterday demanding I remove my security cameras." At the mention of Judith's name, Deputy Morris's posture changed subtly. "Mrs. Harrington, the HOA president." His tone suggested I had accused the Pope of shoplifting. "I have known Judith for 15 years. She runs the annual fundraiser for the department's youth program." Of course she did. I should have realized the connections would run deeper than just the neighborhood. As Deputy Morris half-heartedly completed his report, a car pulled up. Judith emerged, carrying a tray covered with a checkered cloth. She approached with an expression of exaggerated concern. "I heard about the vandalism," she said, her voice dripping with sympathy that did not reach her eyes. "I brought some of my blueberry muffins for you and Deputy Morris. Such a horrible thing to happen in our peaceful community." Deputy Morris accepted a muffin with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Judith, always thoughtful." I declined the offering. Judith's eyes flicked to the garbage strewn across my lawn. "And look at this mess. I will have the association send someone to clean it up. We cannot have unsightly debris lowering property values." The irony was suffocating. Deputy Morris finished his report, promised to look into it, and left with another muffin for the road. Judith lingered, her eyes calculating behind her sympathetic mask. "The board has approved a special assessment," she informed me. $500 for cleanup of unauthorized waste disposal. The notice will arrive tomorrow." They were going to fine me for the garbage they had dumped on my lawn. The sheer audacity would have been impressive if it was not so infuriating. That evening, after spending hours replacing my security cameras with better hidden models and patching my tires, I developed a new strategy. If direct confrontation would not work, perhaps a more creative approach would. I drove to the agricultural supply store in the next county and purchased 4 high-powered motion sensor sprinklers, the kind farmers use to deter deer and other pests from crops. They were powerful enough to spray water nearly 30 feet in any direction when triggered by movement. I also bought waterproof LED lights that would activate simultaneously with the sprinklers. Under cover of darkness, I installed the system inside my barn, carefully positioning the sprinklers for maximum coverage. A vehicle entering the space would trigger all 4 units, creating a water crossfire impossible to escape without a thorough soaking. I programmed them to activate only during evening and night hours, when no legitimate visitor would be entering my barn. As I completed the installation, I placed a small, official-looking sign at the barn entrance. Pest control system active 7 p.m., 7 a.m. Agricultural permit 8742. There was no permit, of course, but the specificity would give it an air of legitimacy. I slept soundly that night for the first time in weeks, waiting for the inevitable. The trap was set. The sprinklers remained untriggered for 2 nights, making me wonder if word of my new pest control system had somehow spread through Judith's network. But on the 3rd night, Friday, my phone exploded with notifications just after 9 p.m. From my kitchen window, I watched the chaos unfold. Headlights had swung into my property as 3 cars approached my barn. A monthly book club meeting at the community center, based on the calendar I had studied. The first vehicle, Judith's white Cadillac, entered the barn confidently. Seconds later, blinding lights flashed on and 4 powerful jets of water activated simultaneously. The screams were immediate. Car doors flew open as occupants tried to escape the deluge, only to trigger additional sprinkler coverage. Judith emerged from her Cadillac, designer outfit drenched, hairspray failing against the onslaught of water. She stood in shock for a moment before her head whipped toward my house. Even from this distance, I could feel the heat of her glare. The other cars backed away hastily, but not before their occupants received a thorough soaking. Some slipped in the mud created by the sprinklers, further adding to their indignity. Judith attempted to approach my house but triggered another motion sensor, sending a fresh spray in her direction. She retreated, pointing furiously at my window. I sipped my tea, resisting the urge to wave. My phone rang at 6:07 a.m. the next morning. It was Ben, his voice tight with suppressed laughter. "Emergency HOA meeting. Today, noon, community center." He paused. "They are coming for you now." Judith spent the night calling everyone. I thanked him for the warning and began preparing. I gathered all my documentation, loaded the security footage onto a tablet, and reviewed relevant HOA bylaw sections. This confrontation had been inevitable from the start. The community center buzzed with tension when I arrived. Nearly every resident of Quiet Acres was present, faces I had barely seen during my time there, all drawn by the drama unfolding in their usually sedate community. Whispers ceased as I entered. Some looked away. Others stared openly with expressions ranging from hostility to curiosity to poorly concealed amusement. Judith sat at the head table, hair meticulously styled again but face tight with rage. Her clothes were impeccable as always, but I noticed she had abandoned her usual white or light colors for a dark navy pantsuit, less likely to show water stains if history repeated itself. "This emergency session will come to order," she announced, voice brittle. "We are here to address serious violations committed by the owner of Lot 47. For the next 20 minutes, Judith detailed my crimes against the community: obstruction of shared facilities, installation of invasive surveillance, and finally, the creation of a dangerous water hazard that endangered association members and caused thousands in damages to vehicles and personal property. I move that we impose the maximum fine of $5,000, she concluded, and begin proceedings to revoke membership privileges. His behavior represents a clear danger to this community." Murmurs rippled through the room. I raised my hand, and reluctantly, Judith acknowledged me. "Before the vote," I said, standing with my tablet in hand, "I would like to present some evidence and clarifications." I connected my tablet to the projector and began methodically dismantling her narrative. I showed the original property deeds indicating the barn was fully private. I displayed county records proving the easement was for utility access only. I presented time-stamped photos of cars parked in my barn without permission, oil stains damaging my property, and the progression of encroachment over weeks. Then came the security footage, grainy but clear enough, of hooded figures slashing my tires and dumping garbage. I had enhanced the audio, which now clearly captured a female voice saying, "Let's see how he likes cleaning up after others." The room grew uncomfortably quiet. "And finally," I said, "regarding the water system that was triggered last night, my property is zoned agricultural residential. I installed standard agricultural pest deterrent systems inside my private structure with appropriate warning signage. If unauthorized persons entered private property despite warnings and encountered the system, that does not constitute a hazard created by the property owner." From the back of the room, an elderly couple raised their hands. It was the Hendersons, longtime residents who rarely attended meetings, according to Ben. "We were in the second car last night," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice wavering but determined. "No one told us that barn was private property. Judith said it was community parking. We got soaked through. Harold's arthritis is acting up from it. But if that is his private barn, why were we told to park there?" Other voices joined in, questions mounting. Who authorized the barn as parking? When was this voted on? Why were the cameras really redirected? The unified front Judith had counted on began fracturing visibly. Judith slammed her gavel repeatedly. "Order! This is not relevant to the violations at hand." But the tide had turned. A procedural vote was called to table the motion against me and instead investigate the HOA's authority regarding my property. It passed by a narrow margin. Judith's face contorted with fury. She gathered her materials with jerky movements, knocking over a water glass in the process. "This association has stood for standards and values for 15 years under my leadership," she said, voice rising. "If you choose to allow this saboteur to undermine everything we have built, you will regret it. He is a liability to this community." She stormed out, followed by her core supporters, about a third of those present. The remaining residents sat in awkward silence until Ben stood up. "I move we adjourn and reconvene when cooler heads prevail," he suggested. No one objected. As people filed out, many nodded to me with newfound respect or curious reappraisal. The battle was not over, but for the first time I was not fighting alone. The fragmentation of quiet acres happened rapidly after the emergency meeting. Residents fell into three camps: Judith loyalists who avoided me entirely, a curious middle group who began asking questions about HOA practices, and a small but growing faction who openly challenged the status quo. The parking around my barn ceased completely. I used the reprieve to consult with Marcus Reynolds, a property attorney specializing in HOA disputes. He reviewed my documentation with increasing interest, occasionally letting out low whistles at particularly egregious examples. "They have overstepped in multiple areas," he confirmed, closing the folder containing my evidence. "The easement application is the most blatant. It clearly refers to utility access for the power lines, not a right to use private structures as public facilities." "Can I get them to back off permanently?" I asked. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Better than that. We can establish clear boundaries with legal force behind them, and potentially recover damages for the unauthorized use and vandalism." He drafted a series of letters. The first was a formal cease and desist notice to the HOA board regarding all access to my barn and private property. The second was a demand for documentation of all HOA bylaw changes and votes involving my property over the past 5 years. The third was a notice of intent to pursue legal remedies if compliance was not immediate. Send these by certified mail, Marcus advised. Return receipt requested. Document everything about the delivery. Within days of the letters arriving, the dynamics in Quiet Acres shifted again. Two board members resigned abruptly. Gatherings at the community center became subdued affairs with dwindling attendance. Judith was notably absent from public spaces, though lights burned in her house late into the night. Ben reported that emergency board meetings were happening behind closed doors. Word is, they cannot find records of the actual votes authorizing the use of your barn, he told me during one of our now regular coffee meetings on his porch. Judith kept all that documentation herself, and apparently some of it has mysteriously disappeared. The HOA's response to my attorney's letters was a study in retreat disguised as magnanimity. They acknowledged the misunderstanding regarding my barn while neither admitting wrongdoing nor accepting responsibility for the vandalism. They proposed a compromise where limited overflow parking might be permitted on special occasions with written approval from the property owner. Marcus advised against accepting any compromise that acknowledged their right to use my property. Give them an inch now, they will take a mile later. We need to establish absolute boundaries. His second round of letters was more pointed, requesting financial damages for the documented incidents and demanding a formal retraction of all claims regarding community access to my property. Meanwhile, I filed paperwork with the county to officially designate my property as agricultural use, emphasizing the barn as an agricultural structure. This zoning classification would add another layer of protection against HOA encroachment, as agricultural use had precedence over aesthetic concerns in our county. The county inspector who came to verify my property status was professional and thorough. He noted that the barn qualified easily for the designation given its original purpose and structure. He also commented on the newly installed fencing and clearly posted private property signs I had added, all within HOA guidelines for material and height, but unmistakable in their message. "You having trouble with neighbors?" he asked casually as he completed his paperwork. "Just clarifying boundaries," I replied. He nodded knowingly. "Smart to get the agricultural designation. Gives you more flexibility and protection. Your sprinkler's still working good." News traveled fast in small communities. The inspector handed me the approved paperwork with a barely suppressed smile. That evening, a formal notice arrived from the county zoning board, copied to the HOA board, confirming my agricultural designation and the restrictions it placed on third-party access and use. It effectively terminated any HOA authority over my barn and limited their influence on other aspects of my property management. I thought this would end the matter. I was wrong. 3 days later, Ben appeared at my door, expression grim, holding a document. "They are circulating this for signatures," he said, handing me a petition. "Judith is making one last play." The petition called for an emergency vote to amend the HOA charter, specifically to overrule county zoning limitations in cases where community welfare and historical practice were at stake. It framed my actions as a threat to property values and community identity. Most disturbing were the signatures, over 30 of them, representing a majority of households. I scanned the names, recognizing many, but something seemed off about the handwriting. I compared signatures I knew, the Hendersons, who had spoken up at the meeting, and several others who had privately expressed support for my position. The signatures did not match their normal handwriting. "These are forged," I realized aloud. Ben nodded grimly. I thought so too. Judith is desperate now. This is her last stand. I contacted Marcus immediately, sending photographs of the petition and known authentic signatures from other HOA documents for comparison. His response was immediate. We would file a formal complaint with the county regarding document fraud and petition the court for an emergency injunction against any HOA actions based on the fraudulent petition. Quiet Acres was about to get significantly louder. The forgery allegations hit Quiet Acres like a thunderclap. Marcus did not merely file complaints, he orchestrated what he called a shock and awe response. County investigators arrived to collect petition samples and interview signatories. A court clerk delivered injunction notices prohibiting any HOA actions based on the disputed document. Local news caught wind of the story. A small item on page 6 about Homeowners Association fraud investigation that nevertheless sent shockwaves through the community. Judith's house went dark for 3 days. When she emerged, the transformation was visible. Her perfect posture had collapsed into something defensive. Her immaculate appearance showed signs of hasty assembly. Most telling was her silence. No emergency meetings called, no letters distributed, no appearance at community gatherings. The HOA board, now reduced to Judith and 2 loyal followers, issued a terse statement announcing a reorganization period, during which all non-essential functions would be suspended. Reading between the lines, everyone understood. The regime was crumbling. I continued my methodical reclamation project. I replaced the barn doors with sturdier versions, complete with proper locks. I installed permanent, legitimate signage marking private property boundaries. I repainted the structure, choosing a warm red that honored its agricultural heritage while making it unmistakably distinct from community property. The sprinkler system remained in place, though rarely activated now that unauthorized parking had ceased. Its existence had become something of a local legend. Parents used it as a cautionary tale for children. Stay off private property or you will get the sprinkler treatment. While teenagers dared each other to approach the barn at night, running away shrieking with laughter when the motion lights activated, I had adjusted the sensors to trigger lights before water for safety reasons. 2 weeks after the forgery revelation, a certified letter arrived containing Judith's resignation as HOA president, effective immediately. The letter cited health concerns, rather than acknowledging any wrongdoing. Her house went on the market the following day. The listing described it as a perfect home in a quiet community with strong values, her final attempt at narrative control. An interim board was elected, composed primarily of moderate residents who had emerged as voices of reason during the conflict. Their first official act was to commission an independent audit of all HOA bylaws, voting records, and financial transactions from the past decade. Their second was to formally acknowledge that my barn and property were privately owned and not subject to HOA easements or community use provisions. Ben was elected to the new board despite his protests that he was too old for such nonsense. Someone has to be the institutional memory, he grumbled when telling me the news. Make